higher education this morning, starting on page 36, and then putting resources and transportation off until tomorrow, Thursday. We'll move on after higher education to public safety, judicial, and labor. So thank you for joining us this morning. Ms. Bosler. Actually, we'll start with our LAO.
Jason Constantouris, LAO.
Mr. Constantouris, welcome back.
Thank you.
All right.
Starting on page 36, this item pertains to the Center for California Studies, which its main activities include supporting the fellows programs. Both houses approved to provide $20,000 for employee compensation. In addition, the main difference between the Senate and the Assembly is the Assembly provided an additional $480,000. $420,000 of those dollars were intended to replace funding formerly coming out of the Assembly budget, and the remaining $60,000 are intended to provide a 3% COLA for fellow stipends. And we would just note that since this action had taken place, staff and our office have had additional conversations with the center. We think a 3% compensation, our 3% stipend increase would come out to $53,000. $60,000 is a 3.4% increase in stipends.
Ms. Bosler.
We're supportive of the Senate version here. It's consistent with the funding level that we proposed in the May revision.
Right. And Mr. Constantouris, do you have any thoughts about the Assembly proposal?
We just would note that it's in the past, we've recommended providing COLAs, and it seems reasonable to provide a COLA for stipends in addition to the COLA that's already being provided for employees.
I think that seems to be the major issue here is really the movement from the Assembly budget to the general funds for the fellows, much more than just the $480,000. That seems to be the major issue. 420, I guess it is. Okay. Any thinking on that?
So our budget reflected the budget that with adjustments because there were these employees that work for the center are essentially CSU employees. So there was increased costs associated with healthcare and employee compensation, other employee compensation benefits. And so those costs were adjusted in the January budget. So the January budget did reflect an increase in costs over the current year. And we actually had proposed putting their funding in the CSU budget. We're comfortable keeping it as a separate standalone item. But the rationale behind that is that these are, in fact, CSU employees, the staff people, not the fellows, and that they should be getting the regular adjustments, annual adjustments that other staff at CSU, or the budget, the overall CSU budget gets. So that was our rationale, but we're comfortable leaving it in a standalone item for now. This additional money that the Assembly has put in, I just don't have a lot of information about how it's been used or what it's been used for. But I'd be happy to look into it and get back to you or continue to discuss it.
That would be helpful. I think there was a time that the Assembly put in the resources during difficult times, but it may have been funded in another source in the past, and so we're backing out of a lot of things that we've done in the past out of the Assembly budget that comes out of our members' budgets, so that we're not funding a whole lot of extraneous things that we've done in the past. We did child care, we did a host of things out of the Assembly budget. And so this is one of those items that the Speaker feels very strongly should go back into the general fund. Now the times are better. Okay?
Thank you, Assemblywoman. Yes, Assemblywoman Melendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So did they receive a raise recently? I thought
it's a different group.
That's correct.
It's a different group?
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
In the last budget year, they received a 5% increase in their stipends. The fellows.
5%? You sure of that number?
I can get back and double check that, but I think that's the increase.
Okay.
I think,
Well, because the fellows that I communicated with said they got a 30% raise.
they did, the stipend previously was $1,972 monthly, and it was increased in last year's Budget Act to $2,550.
So it's a 30% increase?
closer to 30%.
Not a 5% increase.
That numerical, that's the same number I have, so I must have the percentage wrong on that.
Okay. So they got an increase, so there's a 30% increase in effect for the current budget year, right? But, all right, I just want to make sure I understand, because we're asking, or the suggestion is that we increase the COLA despite the fact that there's already been a 30% increase. So I'm just wondering why that is.
The way it's, and I don't have the data going back on past increases, the way it's been described to us is that in that large COLA was in response to the fact that the previous stipends had been held flat for a number of years, and that it was intended to replace those years in which it was not increased.
And I certainly understand that. My question, though, is why are we putting a COLA increase in despite the fact that we've already given a 30% increase?
Right, and what we've been told, and again, we haven't seen data to back this up yet, so I don't have that data, but the suggestion is that that increase would essentially provide inflation for those years in which inflation was not provided, so that in real terms their stipends would be
just catch up.
It was catch up, exactly. We would note that inflation this year is anticipated to be about 1.7%. So you could provide, it's a bit higher than other.
Okay, thank you. I don't know that we can back pay people for pay that they never received because they weren't a fellow at the time that they missed out on the pay, but I get what you're saying. Thank you.
Okay. Page 37, Channel Island Engineering Program. And this was an assembly proposal. Mr. Constantouris?
Yes, this was an assembly proposal. It provides $500,000 in one-time funding to establish an engineering school at the Channel Islands campus. We would recommend in this case going with the Senate for two reasons. One, it appears that the program hasn't completely gone through the traditional process to approve a new program. Typically, that process involves a campus-level review, then a chancellor's level review, then trustees' approval. And historically, that also involved a review from an independent state agency that reviewed new programs. That state agency was no longer funded beginning in 2011. It appears that this new engineering school hasn't yet been fully approved by the Academic Senate on the campus level. And so it's unclear at this time for the need for a new engineering program at that campus. And then secondly, we would note that in the case that it is decided there is a need for a new engineering program, historically that's been funded out of the CSU's base, and so we normally don't provide earmarks for new programs at specific campuses. Thank you.
So as you stated, has not gone through the review process. This would be creating a new precedent. And one other question that came to mind is, $500,000 sufficient to establish an engineering school?
Right, and unfortunately, this proposal came up recently, so we're not familiar with what the specific costs are for this particular program, but traditionally programs can vary in cost when you create a new program.
I guess the answer to that question would come out of the review process.
Yes, that's correct.
All right. I could save you your breath if you
We
want.
agree with the LAO, and we would defer to the CSU Board of Trustees on how and when they want to establish new programs at individual campuses.
Sure. All right, any other questions or comments on this? Keep moving. Eligibility study. This was a Senate proposal.
This was a Senate proposal to provide $1 million to do a freshman eligibility study to be conducted by CSU. As many of you are familiar, the master plan designates the universities to draw from eligibility pools for their freshman admissions. UC, it's the top 12.5%, CSU, it's the top 33%. because they have to draw from these eligibility pools, it's difficult to determine whether or not they're actually drawing from these pools. Their admission standards are intended to draw from these pools. The way we've historically determined this is through an eligibility study whereby we examine a sample of transcripts and determine whether or not those admission standards are drawing from the correct proportion. In years, for example, where CSU might be deemed to be drawing from the top 34% rather than the top 33%, they would tighten admissions criteria. In years where they were under, say, drawing 30%, they would loosen their admissions criteria and admit more students. The last eligibility study was conducted in 2007. We think it's a bit outdated, and so this proposal is consistent with our recommendation to provide an eligibility study.
And have you had conversations with CSU? How do they feel about this?
CSU has reported that that they could do the study. They're considering also working with a third party to help with some of the statistical analysis. In addition, they've raised some concerns about changing SAT scores and changing course requirements related to Common Core. In our view, those changes are something to consider, but traditionally, the College Board has changed test scores in the past. They typically are able to crosswalk those scores, and we think that that would not invalidate an eligibility study. In addition, the state normally does this frequently, so every 3 to 5 years. So this wouldn't be the last eligibility study. We would do another eligibility study again in the future. So.
And do you know if the $1 million was based on the 2007 study cost, and was that general fund supported?
The $1 million cost is not based on the $2007 cost.
Do we know how much that cost?
Well, it's based on a cost that the universities identified to do the contract to acquire and electronically convert the transcripts so that they could analyze them. They report spending about $1 million. In 2007, the state allocated funding historically to the California Post-Secondary Education Commission,
right, that
no longer exists. So the universities report in prior years funding those contracting costs out of their own base.
Okay. And Ms. Bosler, sorry.
Christian Osmani with Finance. I think, we support the Assembly version, which doesn't include this. We don't, we think the idea of an eligibility study and understanding eligibility is one piece and is an important piece of how we think about higher education. We note that CSU sets its own admissions policies and has the data and can work with K-12 schools to get the data to do such a study, so we don't believe the additional funding is necessary. But we would kind of emphasize that eligibility is only one piece of what we ought to be thinking about in terms of higher education. A traditional eligibility study doesn't consider the number of students who enter either of the universities with remediation needs or additional needs for basic skills, as we discussed yesterday, and it doesn't look at the number of transfer students that either of the universities should be accepting. So we think it's a limited piece of data. We think the universities could collect that data on their own, but that there's a broader conversation that the state ought to be having.
And given that we don't have the post-secondary education, it was commission, where do you think this should fall then as a default to the university as opposed to the general fund?
We think so. We think that that's a reasonable, the universities are in a reasonable position given that they set their eligibility, that their admissions requirements, that they should be in the position of evaluating what proportion of high school students meet those requirements.
All right. Both sides of the argument. Oh, yes, Senator Nielsen.
Well, whether it's absorbed or funded, I do believe this is important data, and it's not just one of many. It's something that's a benchmark and has been for 50 years. So I think we need to work it out one way or the other. That's my point.
Very good. Page 39 is CSU investment policy trailer bill language. This is coming from the Assembly. Mr. Costouris.
Right, this proposal came out of the Assembly. it is a trailer bill language to give CSU additional authority in choosing its own investments. Just as a high-level context, CSU currently maintains a reserve of funding of about $3 billion. About half of that is tuition. The other half is funding from their auxiliary services, such as housing fees. And current law restricts them to invest this reserve in high-quality, low-risk assets, the same limitations put on the Treasury when it makes its investments. This proposal would strike out that part of the code that limits CSU to making those investments. It doesn't affect other agencies, just CSU, giving CSU full discretion to make its own investment decisions. It also establishes a requirement that CSU create in the Board of Trustees a committee that would manage this new authority. In our view, this is a major policy change. It raises two major considerations. First, what is the appropriate size that CSU should have in terms of its reserves? And two, given that size, what's the appropriate level of risk that it should be able to take on? Because this is a major policy change, we think if you're not comfortable with whether or not these questions have been evaluated, you could consider it as part of the policy process. It isn't necessary to enact the budget. On the other hand, if you've considered that these are issues that have been vetted, you're more than, you're able to get it through the trailer bill process. So thank you.
So your point is this is not time sensitive. There's no need for it to be through the budget.
It's not necessary to enact the budget. That's right.
Right. And how is it? I know UC has no limitations.
UC has no limitations, and they have two investment funds that they manage. One, they invest, is similar to CSU's current investments. It's limited to low-risk assets. The other one is smaller. It involves their longer-term reserve, and they invest that in higher-risk assets.
And do other state agencies have similar investment limitations as CSU currently has?
That's not my understanding, but I'm not aware of other departments that have that. Most departments, I believe, go through the treasurer to make their investments, which is limited to those same assets.
That's different information. So if you could look into that, please, because we have some different information that says that virtually all other state agencies do have the same restrictions as CSU.
I'm sorry.
You're saying
that's what I'm sorry. That's what I meant to say.
Oh, that's what,
did I say that incorrectly?
Well,
I meant to say that virtually all other state agencies operate through the treasurer's offices. They have the same restrictions that CSU has currently. Right. CSU, most state agencies do not. Yeah, right.
We got it. We got it. We got it. All right. Ms. Bosler.
Yeah, this was not part of our proposal, but we do note that there are some ongoing concerns with that the treasurer has raised, and I think there are staff working through those issues, but not resolved yet.
And clearly, the concern would be any risk. I would imagine that if we did, from a public policy perspective, determine that not unlike UC, CSU should have some flexibility, that there's got to be a way to word it so that the risk is mitigated significantly, but there is additional flexibility from what they have today.
Yes, and I believe that's the basis of the discussions going on right now.
Okay.
Yeah, we this proposal came forth from CSU itself, obviously, and we recognize it's a work in progress. So we're ways off from actually landing at this point because it needs better language to be able to provide the security that folks feel we need to have, as well as flexibility at the same time. So it's a work in progress. We'll continue the conversation. Okay?
Or we could just hand it over to Senator Lara.
Yeah, he'll deal with it.
Page 40 is new campus study trailer bill language, again coming from the Assembly.
This proposal is to include trailer bill language to have LAO, our office, do a study for the need for a new CSU campus. And this study would be due on January 1st, 2017. Our understanding is that the language comes from another bill that worked its way through the legislature, AB 38. That
Assemblywoman Eggman's bill.
correct. And that would have us look at a number of data that are already available in addition to some data that CSU would have to provide us. So we're here to answer any questions you have about that bill.
Okay.
Yeah, I think given all of us have had various concerns. Mr. Block, I know, has had concerns over years concerning a CSU in the San Diego area. You know, we've even had the people in San Diego to donate 300 acres of land to the state for us to do whatever, to build a campus. It's interesting. But so this comes out of that and the fact that we don't have a higher commission. The Commission on Higher Ed doesn't exist anymore. They used to do this work. And I think when LAO did come to San Diego to talk about campuses, one of the things they talked about was we needed a process, but if not, then the LAO would probably be the place to go to get some kind of impartial information about the need. Because we keep talking about enrollment and whether or not we can satisfy the enrollment of all the kids in California, yet we don't have the mechanism anymore to determine where campuses go. You know, what we had before, kind of an impartial group that basically could look at the whole state, figure out where the population's going, where the academic needs are, and those kinds of things, and then land on recommendations if we were to expand, where we would build new campuses. And so this would get us to that level so that it kind of gets out of the political arena a little bit, rather than everybody wants it in their neighborhood, start talking about where do we need to put it. And if we were to do any additional CSUs, and now we ask for the UC as well, where will we put those campuses based on the needs of the kids and the populations? We're going to do a population study about freshmen. So we need to know whether or not we're meeting the needs of the population that's here. And so this is a modest way of us getting to what we used to have in terms of some kind of official statements about where the population is, what we need to do, how we're going to meet the needs of California kids in the future, because that seems to be a major priority for us. And we get varying bits and pieces of information. If we talk to UC or CSU, sometimes they tell us they can meet all the enrollment things depending on what the issue is a day. And then if another issue, if it's dealing with money, they tell us they can't meet that enrollment. I mean, it goes back and forth. And so this will give us an opportunity to really begin to, once again, master plan for CSU and UC.
Well stated. Clearly, more information is better, and we could benefit from it. Curious, though, do we as a legislative body have much of a history with directing these kinds of analyses from you? And if we do, is it appropriate that we might fund your services additionally on top of everything else that you're doing? And how labor intensive is such an analysis for you?
Well, our office in recent years has had additional statutory reports, a lot of them pertaining to higher education. In recent years, we've done reports.
Is there much of a difference between a report and an analysis?
No, I'm using them interchangeably.
Okay, good.
And we've done reports on the recent transfer reform between community colleges and CSU. Currently, we have some reports that look at new remediation policies at CSU, the new doctorate programs, and of course, we're always here to, that's our function is to help the legislature meet its goals. At the same time, a lot of these functions, as you noted, were originally part of CPEC's role, and I think that there's been a broader conversation about the need to, in cases where we found CPEC's role helpful, such as collecting data, reviewing new campuses, new programs, how to distribute that throughout the state now that there's no longer a CPEC in existence.
So this would be just one of a number of reports that you'll be doing for us if we were to move forward?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
At no cost.
Ms. Bosler.
I would just note that we are currently in the midst of doing some modest expansions in both systems. The UC Merced is still in a growth phase and is planned to grow to 10,000 students by 2020, as well as in this budget, the Cal Poly Pomona campus was the old Lanterman Developmental Center was transferred to the Cal Poly Pomona campus, and the idea there is that they would be able to grow some of their programs that will meet the needs of students at that campus. So there is some growth going on. I would also just note that we have significant maintenance of our existing infrastructure out there, and we have some money set aside for that for both campuses in the budget. But building new campuses just builds significant additional costs into the budget. So I think our focus in the near term is really on making sure that our current infrastructure is well maintained and that we improve the efficiency of the current system so it does provide more access to students by moving the students that do come to CSU and UC through in a timely manner and don't get stuck in those bottleneck courses and other things that delay graduation times.
Okay. Yes, Assemblywoman.
Thank you. I just have one question. Do you have the UC or CSUs, have they asked for a new campus? Have they expressed interest in?
Would never ask for it without money.
And not to our knowledge at this time.
Okay, thank you.
Most campuses will generally not ask for a new campus because it competes with their campus for money and resources, even if they acknowledge that the campus is needed. We've had conversations with our president at SDSU, who's not necessarily opposed to a new campus, but not in favor of a new campus because they're being cut financially. So it's not likely that someone is going to jump up and volunteer to have a new campus to compete for the limited dollars that we have. And so that's real clear. But it is important because, even though and all of the things we raise are important issues in terms of talking about infrastructure, making sure what we have is good and all those kinds of things. But we also have to realize that we have some educational deserts in California where kids live and for miles and miles around, there's no campus for them. So for them to go to a UC or CSU is quite a distance compared to those who are in the inner city who can still live at home, cut the cost, and go to the CSU and UC. And so we have to recognize that. I'm hoping that in our data analysis, we discover those areas. I think that's why Stockton is interested. Even though San Diego talks about a new campus, probably the greatest need is in Imperial Valley, where there is no CSU, or there's a kind of a limp-along CSU with Calexico that we need to beef up and to improve because those students, if they're homebound and have to remain home, there is no CSU or UC for them to engage in education. So this study that can be done without additional resources will be important. It may come back and say we have enough. It may come back and say we're off, or that this is a plan for the next 15 to 20 years based on projections. But I think it's important that we don't continue to bump around in the dark, even though we know we need to improve our campus, need to finish those campuses, need to get all the other stuff up and running, that we don't keep bumping around in the dark with us talking about need for increase in engineers, increase in programs, increase in technology, and we don't have that data. And LAO can hopefully provide us with that impartial information that doesn't cater to any particular member's district, but really talks about what the needs are at the higher ed level for California.
One additional question that comes to mind is, historically, have we ever seen as many applicants rejected or percentage of applicants rejected as we're seeing now in the CSU system?
I believe you're referring to the denied eligibles.
Denied eligibles, right. Yes.
We've only had data going back to 2007. I can't speak to past that period of time. And other data we've seen pertaining to recent years, it looks like a lot of these denied eligibles are focused at specific CSU campuses, primarily the more selective ones. Mm-hmm. And if these students do not designate on their application that they would like to be redirected, they are not automatically redirected. So a new campus may not necessarily address that issue.
Okay. And Ms. Fosler? No.
I just wanted to follow up on some of Assemblymember Weber's comments about those areas of the state that don't have access currently to CSU and UC. And I think there are some innovative things happening at both CSU and UC, and that's more of what we want to encourage through our innovation awards. That includes more correspondence online courses that may meet once a month or twice a month at the campus, but that would allow the student to work from home, which may be 4 or 5 hours a drive to the campus, but then also get the benefit of that in-person contact a couple days a month. So there's definitely a lot of interest and effort to try and do more of those things. I know of one program that CSU Chico has that serves all the Northern California counties in the area of social work, because those Northern California counties were having a very difficult time recruiting and retaining social workers for their county programs, and needed to partner with CSU to work on growing their own that are from those rural areas. And so they instituted an innovative program that was mainly online, but then also met in person a few days a month. So that's also other types of innovative ways to further the reach of our current system.
I assume that social work program is a master's degree program?
This was an undergraduate program.
Upper division?
Yeah.
Upper division, undergraduate program in social work. True. And that sounds good. I mean, and I think many of our campuses do a lot of that extended learning, online learning, but I think most of the data clearly shows us that online learning is not that effective with undergraduates, particularly freshmen, sophomore students from diverse communities do not do as well as online than they do in face-to-face. So, and we'll continue to do the innovation, but I think we still need to know where the people are and where you do online. And the areas where the focus is. So LAO can do the study. It's not going to burst the budget with a zero amount attached to it. And so we would get the information we need to talk about expansion or even just maintenance of where we are. Thank you.
Deferred maintenance. Speaking of which, page 41. So both Senate and Assembly had similar proposals with $1 million difference.
That's right, and to just give some context here, both houses rejected a proposal from the governor to provide $25 million in one-time funding for an awards program that would provide grants to CSU campuses that are working to improve four-year graduation.
Those were the innovative?
Those are the innovation awards. Both houses redirected that funding. The reason why you see this difference here is because the Senate provided $1 million for the eligibility study. So to the extent
that these... Aren't we clever?
What?
Aren't we clever?
Yeah. So to the extent that these two are related, we would recommend going with the Senate because it's consistent with our recommendation to do an eligibility study. But that is the main difference before you hear.
Recommending a maintenance study. Eligibility study.
And we just had a different approach on funding CSU. Obviously, we talked a lot about this yesterday, but $119 million was the base augmentation that was augmented by another $38 million at May revision time. But then there was also two other components. There was a $25 million allocation in January specifically for deferred maintenance, and then another $35 million in cap and trade funds for energy efficiency projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And then also we did have a $50 million program split half between Proposition 98 and non-98 funds that would fund additional innovations between the community colleges and CSUs that allow the campuses to serve more students and serve more students effectively.
All right. On page 42, we have local libraries. And again, we have an augmentation by the Senate.